In a couple of prior segments, we were discussing Rodney Stark's book, The Rise of Christianity, specifically his chapter on the pandemics. We now call them pandemics. Most of history has called them epidemics, but on a global scale, as they were in the Roman Empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, they do deserve the word pandemic. So in this chapter on the epidemics and their impact upon the Roman Empire, Rodney's already discussed the reactions of Christians, specifically Bishop Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, in the 3rd century, and now he's going on to talk about Dionysius, another bishop. Rodney Stark says his fellow bishop, Dionysius, addressed his Alexandrian members in similar tones about the plague and what it should mean to Christians and what it shouldn't mean if you are a Christian in terms of despair. Other people would not think this a time for festival, he wrote, but far from being a time for distress, it is a time for unimaginable joy. That was from Dionysius's festival letters, quoted by Eusebius in Ecclesiastical History. Acknowledging the huge death rate, Dionysius noted that though this terrified the pagans, Christians greeted the epidemic as merely schooling and testing. Thus, at a time when all other faiths were called to question, Christianity offered explanation and comfort. Even more important, Christian doctrine provided a prescription for action. That is, the Christian way appeared to work. And then he has a subhead, Survival Rates and the Golden Rule. At the height of the second great epidemic, around 260, in the Easter letter already quoted above, Dionysius wrote a lengthy tribute to the heroic nursing efforts of local Christians, many of whom lost their lives while caring for others. Here's the quote. Most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of one another. Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ, and with them departed this life serenely happy. For they were infected by others with the disease, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbors, and cheerfully accepting their pains. Many, in nursing and curing others, transferred their death to themselves and died in their stead. The best of our brothers lost their lives in this manner. A number of presbyters, that is elders, deacons, and laymen, winning high commendation, so that death in this form, the result of great piety and strong faith, seems in every way the equal of martyrdom. And that's the end of the Dionysius quote. Stark says, Dionysius emphasized the heavy mortality of the epidemic by asserting how much happier survivors would be had they merely, like the Egyptians in the time of Moses, lost the firstborn from each house. For there is not a house in which there is not one dead. How I wish it had been only one, he says. But while the epidemic had not passed over the Christians, he suggests that pagans fared much worse. He says its full impact fell on the heathen, unquote. Dionysius also offered an explanation of this mortality differential. Having noted at length how the Christian community nursed the sick and dying, and even spared nothing in preparing the dead for proper burial, he wrote, quote, the heathen behaved in the very opposite way. At the first onset of the disease, they pushed the sufferers away and fled from their dearest even, throwing them into the roads before they were dead, and treated unburied corpses as dirt, hoping thereby to avert the spread and contagion of the fatal disease. But do what they might, they found it difficult to escape. End of the quote. Stark says, but should we believe him? If we are to assess Dionysius' claims, it must be demonstrated that the Christians actually did minister to the sick, while the pagans mostly did not. It also must be shown that these different patterns of responses would result in substantial differences in mortality. And his next subhead is Christian and Pagan Responses. It seems highly unlikely that a bishop would write a pastoral letter full of false claims about things that his parishioners would know from direct observation. So, if he claims that many leading members of the diocese had perished while nursing the sick, it's reasonable to believe that this happened. Moreover, there is compelling evidence from pagan sources that this was characteristic Christian behavior. Thus, a century later, that is around 370, the Emperor Julian launched a campaign to institute pagan charities in an effort to match the Christians. Julian complained in a letter to the high priest of Galatia in 362 that the pagans needed to equal the virtues of Christians, for recent Christian growth was caused by their moral character, as he called it, even if pretended, and by their, quote, benevolence towards strangers and care for the graves of the dead, unquote. In a letter to another priest, Julian wrote, quote, I think that even when the poor happen to be neglected and overlooked by the priests, the impious Galileans, as he calls them, observed this and devoted themselves to benevolence, end of quote. And he also wrote, quote, the impious Galileans support not only their poor, but ours as well. Everyone can see that our people lack aid from us, end of quote. Clearly, Julian loathed the Galileans. So next time we'll talk more about Julian and the pagan response to the Christian response to the epidemics. From Rodney Stark's The Rise of Christianity.